Devon didn't feel death coming. A second ago, he was sitting on stage at the world finals of a real-time strategy tournament. His fingers were flying across the keyboard. The crowd was roaring. The screen showed his army in perfect formation. And then something snapped in his head. Quietly and simply. An aneurysm took him faster than he could issue his final command to his units. 23 years of life. Thousands of hours of training. The world championship title just one move away. And darkness. The next thing he was aware of was the cold. A wet, heavy cold that seeped into his bones. He was lying face down in the mud. Not in a hospital bed, not in a morgue. In real mud that smelled of swamp and rot. Devon struggled to lift his head and saw a gray sky covered in clouds. Endless, swampy wastelands stretched out around him. Crooked huts made of wood and clay stood in a cluster on the only dry patch in the middle of the swamp. Chickens wandered between the houses. A skinny goat chewed on a tuft of brown grass. People in rags looked at him with the indifference of those long accustomed to the misfortune of others. Devon tried to stand up and realized that the body did not belong to him. His arms were thin and weak. His legs trembled. He was shorter and about 20 pounds lighter. It was a stranger's body, young and frail. Devon touched his face and didn't recognize his own features. Memories of this body surfaced in fragments. A boy from the village of Muddle, an orphan, no family, friends, nor any skills. The very bottom of the bottom. Devon looked around again, and something familiar clicked in his head. He'd seen this 1,000 times. The starting location. A blank map. 0 resources. 0 units. 0 buildings. A classic hardcore start in a strategy game. The esports player's brain was already working. Assessing resources. Assessing threats. Assessing potential. He didn't know where he was or how he'd ended up here. But he knew one thing. He knew how to win from scratch. By noon, Devon had figured out the basics. The world was called Korhast. The continent was divided among 3 great powers. The Kingdom of Men in the west, with knights and battle magic. The Orc Horde in the north, with brute force and numbers. The Forest Empire of the Elves in the east, with ancient spells and an arrogance so thick you could cut it with a knife. Between these 3 giants lay no man's land, disputed territories that each power claimed as its own, but none controlled completely. Here huddled neutral little villages like Muddle. All 3 sides plundered them, not out of malice, simply because they could. The village of Muddle wasn't even worthy of plunder. There was nothing to steal here. Swamp. Clay, a dozen huts, 3 dozen residents living out their lives in quiet despair. In the entire history of the village, not a single person with a strong class had ever been born here. Class. That was Devon's second discovery. Everyone in this world was born with a class. The system determined it upon reaching adulthood through a ritual. Combat classes joined the armies of the great powers. Craft classes settled in the cities, and the trash classes remained on the margins of life. Class determined everything: strength, status, the future. In Muddle, the class determination ritual was held once a year, and today it was the turn of the boy whose body Devon now occupied. Elder Mela stood by the moss-covered stone in the middle of the village. She was over 60, a gaunt, sinewy woman with eyes that had seen too many hungry winters. She placed her palms on the stone and recited the words that had been spoken in this village dozens of times without a single happy outcome. The stone glowed dimly. Devon felt something stir in his chest, as if an invisible hand had rummaged through him from the inside and struck the right note. Lines visible only to him flashed before his eyes. Class, potter, ability. Creation of clay servants. Silence hung over the village for 3 seconds, and then someone snorted. Then a second one laughed, then a third. A minute later, the whole village was roaring with laughter. Not malicious, weary, bitter. Claymaker, the most useless class in Korhast's memory. The ability to mold small, dim-witted servants out of clay that crumble at a blow and dissolve in the rain. Even among the trash classes, Claymonger was considered rock bottom, a legend of uselessness. A joke told to children so they would learn to pray for a good class. Mela looked at Devon with pity. She said he shouldn't despair, that even with a class like that, one could live a quiet life, that the village would accept him just as he was. Devon didn't hear her. He was looking down, at the clay, at the endless layers of rich, dark clay stretching in all directions to the horizon. The swamp around Muddle stood on a clay cushion tens of meters thick, an endless resource, free, right under his feet. And in his head, the match timer was already ticking. The first 30 seconds, scouting the map, assessing starting resources. Resource 1, clay, endless. Resource 2, labor, 0, but his class creates workers. Resource 3, technology, 0, but his class allows him to specialize units. Resource 4, army, 0, but his class creates soldiers. Devon slowly crouched down and scooped up a handful of clay, wet, heavy, malleable. He clenched it in his fist and felt the system respond. The clay was ready to take shape, any shape he commanded. Devon molded a rough figure the size of his palm, 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. He sent a command to it through the system. Stand up. The figure stirred. It clumsily rose onto its crooked legs. It swayed and froze, waiting for the next command. A woman nearby gasped. Devon paid no attention. He was already molding a second figure, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. 5 crooked clay figures stood before him in a row, dull, fragile, slow, pitiful, perfect entry-level workers. Devon mentally assigned the tasks. The first and second would dig clay from the nearest deposit. The third and fourth would carry it to the dry patch. The fifth would tamp down the area for the future kiln. The 5 little figures turned simultaneously and set off to carry out their orders, synchronously, without questions, without fatigue, without fear. Tariq stood by his forge and watched this with his mouth agape. He was 19, a self-taught blacksmith of average skill, the only one in the village who knew how to work with metal. He asked Devon what he was doing. Devon replied that he was building. Tariq asked, what exactly? Devon said he didn't know yet, but by evening it would become clearer. By sunset, Devon had 20 clay workers. He was sculpting them one after another. Each subsequent one turned out slightly better than the previous one. The system suggested the shape. Devon made adjustments. 20 workers dug up clay, carried stones, cleared the site. They built the first kiln for firing out of stones and raw clay. Devon knew that fired clay was many times stronger than raw clay. This was his first upgrade, the first branch of technology. The residents of Muddle stood in a huddle and watched in silence. In the morning, they had laughed. Now, no one was laughing. For the first time in 100 years in the village of Muddle, someone was building something. Mela approached Devon and stared for a long time at the neat rows of clay workers hauling materials with mechanical precision. She asked who he really was. Devon replied that he was just a guy who happened to have the right class in the right place. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He was the world champion in real-time strategy, and he had just started his best game yet. Devon didn't sleep the first night, not because he didn't want to. The Muddle boy's body ached with fatigue and demanded rest, but the RTS champion's brain was working at full speed. He lay in the crooked hut, staring at the ceiling as he mapped out his build order. A plan of action for the first 7 days. Priority 1, economy. More workers. More clay mining. The kiln needs to be up and running by morning. Fired clay will be the foundation for everything. Walls, tools, new servants. Priority 2, defense. Muddle stands on no man's land. Any orcish squad could wander in here any day. We need at least simple walls and watchtowers. Priority 3, reconnaissance. He knows nothing about his immediate neighbors. Who's around, what villages, what roads, where the threat might come from. In any RTS, the first few minutes decide everything. Whoever hasn't scouted the map loses. Devon got up before dawn and went out to the kiln. 20 clay workers stood where he had left them, motionless, silent, waiting for orders. He gave the command, and they came to life. The first 10 went to the clay quarry. The second 10 began loading the kiln. Devon sat down nearby and began molding new ones. By sunrise, he had 30 workers. By noon, 40. The kiln was up and running. The first batch of fired clay came out uneven and rough, but hard as stone. Devon picked up a piece and squeezed it. It didn't crumble. It didn't break. Durable. He immediately molded a new worker, but this time from a mixture of raw and fired clay. The difference was immediately apparent. The new worker moved with more confidence. His joints didn't creak. His fingers held the tool more firmly. The first unit upgrade was a success. Tariq came to the kiln on the second day. He watched silently as the clay figures hauled stones and mixed the mortar. Then he asked if he could help. Devon looked at him with interest. A blacksmith, the only specialist in the village. A unit. Devon asked if Tariq knew how to make tools. Tariq replied that he could forge simple shovels and pickaxes if there was metal. Devon nodded. There was no metal, but he was already thinking about where to get some. For now, he asked Tariq to make wooden molds for clay bricks, smooth bricks made of fired clay. These would be the walls. Tariq set to work, and by evening had carved out 10 wooden molds. The clay workers began stamping out bricks with the monotonous efficiency of a machine. 10 bricks an hour, 20, 50, 100. They didn't tire. They didn't get distracted. They didn't take breaks. They just mixed the clay, filled the molds, carried them to the kiln, retrieved the finished ones, stacked them, mixed again. Devon watched this and felt a familiar thrill. The economy was on the rise. The resource line on an imaginary graph crept toward the sky. By the end of the third day, he had 50 workers, and a brick wall began to rise around the village. Not tall, just over a meter, but for Muddle, it was like a miracle. Not a single wall had been built here in 100 years. Now the wall was growing before their eyes, row by row, brick by brick. The villagers came out of their huts and stood silently watching the clay workers. Some were afraid. The little clay figures moved too smoothly, too uniformly, faceless, soundless. Only the soft patter of clay feet and the clatter of bricks settling into place. Mela came to Devon on the fourth day. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed her anxiety. She said the people were afraid. She said no one in the village had ever seen anything like this. The clay creatures roamed the village day and night. Children hid in their homes. Women whispered about a curse. Devon stopped. He had become too absorbed in optimizing the economy and had forgotten the most important thing, the people. In an RTS, a base's population is just a number on the screen. Here, the population consists of living people who are afraid of his workers. Devon thought it over and made a decision. He ordered 10 clay workers to approach the nearest garden belonging to old Hesta. Her garden beds were overgrown with weeds because the old woman didn't have the strength to weed them. The 10 workers lined up and began methodically pulling out the weeds, carefully, without damaging a single sprout. Hesta came out of the house and froze on the threshold. The little clay men were weeding her garden silently and diligently. An hour later, the garden beds were clean for the first time in several years. Devon sent 5 more to repair the roof of Bren's hut. He lived with 3 children and got soaked to the skin every time it rained, because there was no one to patch the roof and nothing to patch it with. The clay workers climbed up and began replacing the rotten boards and laying clay tiles. By the evening of the 4th day, the mood in the village had changed. Not completely. The fear hadn't gone away. But something else had been added to it. Cautious hope. The clay workers repaired houses. They weeded the vegetable gardens. They hauled water from the well. They did everything the residents of Muddle lacked the strength and hands to do. Devon realized one more thing about RTS games. In the game, the population's morale is just a slider. Here, it's living eyes that look at you and decide whether to trust or flee. On the fifth day, Devon sent the three strongest clay workers north. Reconnaissance. They were small and gray, perfect camouflage against the backdrop of the marshy plain. Devon ordered them to move quietly and memorize everything they saw: roads, settlements, tracks, armies. Devon himself couldn't see through their eyes. The connection worked differently. He sensed the direction and distance to each servant. He knew if they were alive and unharmed, but he didn't see what they saw. The servants had to return and show what they found. It was inconvenient. Like playing a strategy game without a map. Devon made a mental note. He needed to upgrade his reconnaissance units. He needed a connection. He needed eyes and ears at a distance. On the sixth day, Tariq brought Devon a gift. A small clay ball fired until it rang. Inside the ball was a piece of marsh quartz. Tariq said he'd seen Devon molding workers and had an idea. If you put something hard inside, the clay servant would be stronger. A frame. Devon took the ball and turned it over in his hands. A frame. An internal skeleton made of stone or metal. Reinforced joints. Fortified limbs. It wasn't just a gift. It was an entire branch of technology. Devon looked at Tariq and, for the first time since his rebirth, smiled genuinely. He said that Tariq had just become the chief engineer. Tariq didn't understand. Devon explained. He needed someone who would figure out how to make the clay servants better, stronger, more durable, smarter. Tariq was the only one in the village who thought like an engineer rather than a farmer. Tariq hesitated and said he was just a blacksmith of an ordinary class. Devon replied that class didn't matter. What mattered was what you did with what you had. By the end of the first week, Devon summed things up. 50 clay workers. A wall around the village's perimeter, 1.5 meters high. The kiln is running around the clock. A stockpile of bricks. 3 scouts have gone north. The villagers' gardens have been weeded. The roofs were repaired. The well was deepened. For the first time in a century, the village of Muddle looked like a place where people could live. But Devon knew this was only the beginning, the very beginning, the first 30 seconds of the match. The scouts hadn't returned yet. The map wasn't open. The enemy hadn't been detected. And in this world, the enemy doesn't wait for you to build a base. The scouts returned on the 9th day, 2 out of 3. Devon had lost contact with the third on the 2nd day of the reconnaissance. The connection had simply cut off. That meant he had been destroyed. The 2 who returned were covered in mud and scratches. Devon couldn't interrogate them in the usual sense. The clay servants couldn't speak. But the system offered another way. When Devon touched the first scout, he received a stream of images, blurred, fuzzy, as if looking through a cloudy glass, but sufficient. 2 days' journey north of Muddle stood a larger village, Fen, about 100 inhabitants, also neutral, also destitute, but they had a road leading to the trade route of the Kingdom of Men. To the east, beyond the marshes, the forest began, the border of the elves' territory. The scouts hadn't gone there. Right. To the northwest lay a wasteland giving way to the steppe, the land of the horde. That was where the third scout had disappeared. Devon unfolded the map in his mind. Muddle stood almost exactly at the center of a triangle between the 3 powers. The worst place for defense, the best place for strategy. He saw it like a map in an RTS game. 3 enemies all around, all far away, all busy with each other. None of them were looking at the little village in the swamp yet. The window of opportunity was open, but it would close. Devon doubled production. By the end of the 2nd week, he had 80 workers. The wall around Muddle had grown to 2 meters. Behind the wall, he laid the 2nd ring. Between the rings was a moat filled with swamp water. The clay workers dug it around the clock. Devon began experimenting with specialization. Until now, all his servants had been identical. Small, crooked figures knee-high. Workers. Versatile and weak. Now he tried sculpting with a specific purpose in mind. His first attempt to create a soldier servant failed. Devon molded a larger, heavier figure. He programmed it with the command not to build, but to guard. The system took shape, but the result was disappointing. The soldier moved slower than a worker. His strike was no stronger than a child's poke. Fired clay is brittle against iron. One sword strike, and the clay soldier will crumble. Devon sat down and thought. In an RTS, you can't just mold a second-tier unit using the resources of the first. You need upgrades, technology, improved materials. He called for Tariq. They talked until nightfall. Tariq proposed 3 ideas. First, fire the soldiers whole in a kiln after creation. Not just the bricks, but the clay soldiers themselves. Heat treatment will make them harder. Second, insert a stone frame inside. Bones made of river stone. Devon had tried this with the workers after Tariq's idea, and the result was good. The soldiers needed a sturdier frame. Third, mix clay with sand and ash to achieve different properties. More sand means harder but more brittle. More ash means lighter but weaker. They needed to find the right proportion for combat units. Devon mentally dubbed this an upgrade to the first batch. For the next 3 days, he and Tariq experimented. Devon sculpted. Tariq suggested materials and designs. The kiln ran non-stop. On the 4th day of experimentation, the first real clay soldier was born, as tall as a man, fired to the hardness of stone. Inside, a frame of river stone. The hands ended not in fingers, but in flat shields capable of blocking a blow. On its head, instead of a face, a smooth mask with 2 holes imitating eyes. It was slower than a human, dumber than any recruit, but it felt no pain. It never tired, it never feared, and it obeyed Devon absolutely. Devon placed it at the gate and mentally designated it as the 1st Infantry Class unit. The residents of Muddle looked at the clay soldier and, for the first time, saw not a strange toy, but a defender. The soldier stood motionless as a statue. But when Devon ordered him to walk along the wall, he moved with heavy, mechanical certainty. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the ground. That was on the 15th day, and on the 16th, the orcs came. There were 12 of them, a small band of marauders, not an army, not even a squad, just a dozen orcs who decided to raid the nearest village. They did this regularly. Every few months, a gang like this would wander over to Muddle. They'd take the last of the grain. Sometimes, they'd beat someone up for fun. Then, they'd leave. Devon found out about them from the sentry on the wall. An ordinary human sentry. Old Pole was standing on the wall and saw dust on the horizon. He shouted that the orcs were coming. The village fell into its usual panic. Women grabbed their children. Men hid the few things of value. Everyone knew the drill. When the orcs come, you give them what you have and pray there's no bloodshed. Devon stood on the wall and counted. 12 orcs. Medium-sized. 4 of them had swords. The rest had clubs and axes. No formation, no commander, just a mob used to taking whatever they want from those who can't resist. At his disposal were 6 clay soldiers, 80 workers, the wall, the moat. Devon assessed the situation in seconds. He would lose a direct battle between soldiers and orcs. The 6 soldiers of the first line wouldn't stand a chance against 12 fighters. The orcs were stronger and faster, so no direct battle. Devon began giving orders. 30 workers lined up on the wall with pieces of fired clay in their hands, improvised projectiles. 20 workers stood behind the gate in 3 tight rows, a human shield. 6 soldiers hid behind the corners of the wall, 3 on each side, an ambush. The rest of the workers continued working in the camp, as if nothing were happening. Devon climbed down from the wall and stood behind the gate. Mela grabbed his arm and told him he was crazy, that they should just give the orcs the grain and wait for them to leave. Devon replied that there was no grain, and that if they gave it to them now, they would come back again and again and again. Just like in any strategy, if you pay tribute, it only grows. The orcs approached the wall and stopped. They hadn't expected a wall. In all their raids on Muddle, there had never been a wall here. The gang leader, a burly orc with fangs protruding from his lower jaw, bellowed that they had come for tribute. He ordered them to open the gate before he got angry. Devon stood behind the gate and waited. The orcs moved closer. The leader kicked the gate. The wood creaked, but held. The gate was reinforced with fired clay and stone blocks. The leader flew into a rage and ordered them to break it down. 5 orcs began pounding on the gate. Devon waited until all 5 had crowded together at the entrance. Then he gave the order. 3 clay soldiers emerged from each side of the wall. 6 figures struck at the orcs from the flanks. At the same time, 30 workers on the wall rained down a shower of clay shards onto the attackers' heads. The shards flew thick and true. Every worker threw precisely on Devon's command. A single throw is harmless. 30 simultaneous hits, however, are a serious matter. The orcs roared with rage and surprise. 2 fell under the soldiers' blows. Not killed, just knocked off their feet. The clay soldiers were too weak to pierce an orc's hide and kill it, but they piled on in a mass. Each soldier weighed as much as a man. 6 piled onto 2 orcs and pinned them to the ground. 4 more orcs were floundering under a rain of clay projectiles. 2 workers were crushed by the counterattacks. Devon felt the connection with them snap. Unpleasant. It was as if a finger had been cut off. But he didn't stop. 20 workers behind the gate surged out through a side passage. They clung to the orcs' legs, their small clay hands gripping their ankles. The orcs stumbled and fell. Soldiers piled on top. The orc leader shook off 2 workers and cut down a soldier with a single swing of his sword. The clay body split in 2. But 2 more workers and 1 soldier took the place of the fallen. Devon redirected his units without pause. Every one who fell was replaced by 2. The battle lasted 10 minutes. Not a single orc was killed. But all 12 lay on the ground, covered in clay workers like flies in tar. Devon had lost 14 workers and 2 soldiers. The orc leader lay on his back, staring at the sky. 6 small clay figures sitting on him, holding his arms and legs tightly. Devon walked over and looked down at the leader. The leader growled that they would regret this, that the horde would find out and come with real force. Devon replied calmly. He said let them come, and that every time they came, there would be more clay soldiers, and the walls would be higher. Devon ordered the workers to release the orcs, all 12 of them, unharmed, no trophies, just let them go. Mela asked why he hadn't at least killed the leader. Devon explained. To kill would be to declare war on the horde. 12 dead orcs is cause for a punitive expedition. 12 living orcs defeated by a handful of clay dolls was a humiliating story they would hide from their own kind. No one brags about being beaten by mud. The orcs silently got up and left. Not a single one looked back. Devon stood on the wall and watched them go. The first battle was won, not by strength, by numbers and tactics, just as it should be. After the battle with the orcs, the first refugees arrived in Muddle. Not right away, a week later. First came a family of 4, a man, a woman, 2 children. They came from the south along a swamp trail, barely alive from hunger and the journey. The man said that human tax collectors had burned their village for non-payment. They had heard that somewhere in the swamps there was a settlement that was left alone, because there was nothing to loot. They came to Muddle and saw the walls, the moat, clay workers carrying bricks, vegetable gardens with neat rows, repaired roofs. The man asked if they could stay. Devon said they could. 3 days later, 2 more arrived, an old man and a girl of about 10, his granddaughter. They were from a village that had been ransacked by orcs. Another day later, a woman arrived alone, young and angry, with a cut on her cheek and eyes that held nothing but cold determination. She didn't give her name right away. She just asked who was in charge here. They pointed to Devon. She walked up to him and sized him up. Then she looked at the walls and the clay workers, then back at Devon. She said her name was Lissa, that she was a deserter from the human kingdom's intelligence service, that no one would be looking for her because she was officially dead, and that she wanted to stay if Devon didn't kick her out. Devon asked why she had left the army. Lissa replied that she was tired of killing peasants for taxes that went into the Duke's pockets. Devon asked what she was capable of. Lissa listed them off: reconnaissance, survival, navigation, disguise, close combat, 4 languages, including Orcish and basic Elvish. Devon whistled inwardly. This wasn't just a refugee. This was a hero unit, an elite scout with a set of skills impossible to replicate in Clay, a living woman with combat experience and knowledge of all 3 empires. Devon offered her a position, head of intelligence. Lissa smirked and asked what kind of intelligence. Devon gestured toward the horizon and said, everything. By the end of the first month, Muddle's population had doubled, 60 living people. Among them, 3 blacksmiths, 2 carpenters, 1 herbalist, 1 former soldier with a broken leg that had crookedly, and Lissa. Devon assigned everyone as resources, not cynically, effectively. Each person was given a task suited to their skills. The blacksmiths worked with Tariq to improve the clay soldiers. The carpenters built real houses instead of huts. The herbalist treated the sick and taught Devon about local plants. The former soldier trained the clay soldiers in drill and combat. Or rather, he demonstrated to Devon how soldiers were formed, and Devon instilled that knowledge into the new servants. Absorbing patterns worked not only with objects, knowledge could also be imprinted. If Devon observed a fighting technique, he could create a clay soldier that moved the same way. Rougher, slower, but following the same principles. Devon began experimenting with this ability. He asked the former soldier, Court, to demonstrate the basic stance of a human kingdom infantryman. Court demonstrated. Devon sculpted a soldier while keeping the image of that stance in his mind. The new clay warrior assumed the position. Not perfectly, about 70%. But that was 70% better than nothing. Next step. Devon asked Lissa to show him how a scout moves. Quietly, low to the ground, unnoticed. Lissa demonstrated. Devon created a clay scout, small, dark, with long fingers for climbing. The new scout moved as quietly as a cat. Not as quietly as Lissa, but quietly enough to slip past a sleeping sentry. Devon sent 5 new scouts in all directions, this time with a precise route mapped out by Lissa. She knew the map of the no man's land better than any local. Lissa proved invaluable. She told Devon what he couldn't learn from the fragmented memories of the boy's body from Muddle. The 3 great powers had been teetering on the brink of war for 200 years. None could defeat the other 2. So they fought through proxies, through mercenaries, through raids on the no man's land, through trade embargoes, through espionage, a Cold War with periodic outbreaks of hot conflict. The Kingdom of Men was the most organized, a feudal system, knights, class-based magic. Battle mages were rare, but each was worth 100 soldiers. The kingdom's army was disciplined and well-armed, but slow-moving and dependent on supplies. The orc horde was the most numerous. Orcs multiplied rapidly, fought fiercely, and knew no word for retreat. But their economy was primitive. They lived by raiding and tribute. Their infrastructure was at the level of camps. Each clan was on its own. They united only when a sufficiently strong leader appeared. The forest empire of the elves was the most technologically advanced. Their magic surpassed that of humans by an order of magnitude. But there were few elves. They lived long but reproduced slowly. Every elf was precious. That's why they fought with others' hands whenever they could, and with their own only when there was no choice. Their arrogance was legendary. To them, all other races were clay. Devon smirked at that word. Clay. An interesting coincidence. He asked Lissa what she knew about the Potter class. Lissa said nothing. She'd never heard of anyone with that class who'd done anything significant. The class was considered so worthless that they didn't even study it. They just knew it existed and laughed at it. Devon nodded. It didn't surprise him. But somewhere on the edge of his consciousness, a question stirred. Why? Why was a class capable of creating an endless army from a free resource considered trash? Why, in 1,000 years, had no one done what Devon had done in a month? The answer might be simple. No one was an RTS champion. No one knew how to manage units. But Devon felt the answer was more complicated. In RTS, if something seems too good to be true, it means you're missing the catch. By the end of the first month, Devon took inventory. 120 clay workers, 20 first-tier clay soldiers with stone frames and firing, 5 new-type clay scouts, a 2-meter wall around the entire perimeter, a moat, 2 stone-fortified gates, 3 kilns operating around the clock, Tariq's workshop with 3 blacksmiths, residential buildings for 60 people, vegetable gardens, an irrigation system made of clay pipes, 2 months' worth of food supplies. This was no longer a village. It was a small, fortified settlement with an economy and an army. Devon looked down at Muddle from the top of the wall and thought about how far he'd come in 30 days. In an RTS, this would be the end of the early game. He'd established a base. He'd launched the economy. He'd produced his first wave of units in place. Now the mid-game begins. Scaling up, expansion, diplomacy, and the first serious contact with the major players. Devon looked north. Somewhere out there were the orcs who would return. To the west, somewhere out there was the kingdom of men, which would one day notice the new settlement on its border. To the east, somewhere out there were the elves, who knew more than anyone and spoke less than anyone. The mid-game had begun. On the 40th day, Devon left Muddle for the first time. He had hesitated for a long time. Every RTS player knows. If the commander is killed, the game is over. Devon was the sole controller of the entire clay army. Without him, the workers would freeze. The soldiers would stop. Construction would grind to a halt. He was the single point of failure for the entire system. But it was impossible to stay behind the wall forever. He needed to see the village of Fen with his own eyes. Scouts reported fragments of information. Fen was larger. It stood on the road. It had trade ties with the nearest human city. They had metal. Iron. Not much, but enough for Devon to finally give his soldiers real weapons. Devon left Tariq in charge of the construction. Lissa went with him, and 20 clay soldiers as guards. The rest of the servants remained in Muddle and continued working according to the last order. Devon could sense them from a distance, a faint hum at the back of his head. 120 points of consciousness working without his attention. Simple workers could carry out the last order autonomously. Dig, carry, build. But if something changed, if they were attacked, without Devon, they wouldn't be able to regroup. 20 minutes. Devon mentally timed it. If happens in Muddle, he'll need 20 minutes to run back. Too long. He needs to solve this problem. Lissa led him along animal trails between the swamps. She moved silently and quickly. Devon stumbled over every root. The boy from Muddle's body was weak and untrained. Devon had never really cared about physical fitness in his past life. Hands and a head. That was all an esports player needed. Here, it was a problem. Lissa noticed his clumsiness and said nothing, but Devon could see her sizing him up, assessing him, deciding whether she could trust a commander who was out of breath after an hour's walk. Devon knew he had to earn her trust, not with his body, but with results. Fen appeared by evening. The village was 3 times the size of Muddle. Wooden houses, a palisade, a small market, a smithy with a real forge, fields around the village planted with rye, and people, lots of people, about 100. Devon ordered the soldiers to stop behind the hill. Entering a stranger's village with an army of clay warriors was a bad idea. He went with Lissa, just the 2 of them, like a simple traveler. The village elder, Fen, was a large man named Borthen. His skin was weathered by the wind, a blacksmith's hands, a 3rd-rank blacksmith, a stroke of luck by local standards. Borthen greeted Devon warily. He had heard of Muddle. He'd heard that someone was building walls out of clay there. He'd heard that the orcs had been driven away, but he didn't believe it. Devon didn't try to convince him with words. He asked for a little clay. Borthan gave him a handful. Devon molded a small worker right before his eyes. The figure came to life and stood on Devon's palm. Borthan recoiled. Then he stepped closer. Then he reached out a finger and poked the figure. The figure grabbed his finger with its little hands and wouldn't let go. Borthan laughed. For the first time in a long while, judging by how unusual it looked on his face. Devon proposed a deal. Muddle would supply Fen with clay workers. For free. 10 of them. They would build, repair, and dig. Tirelessly. Without food. Without pay. In return, Fen would sell Muddle iron at a fair price. And opens a trade route. Borthan thought it over. He wasn't stupid. He asked what the catch was. Devon replied that the catch was that when the orcs, or the human tribute collectors, came, Fen would stand by Muddle's side and not be alone. Borthan thought about it for 3 days. Devon and Lissa waited in the guest hut. On the second day of waiting, Lissa told Devon what she had learned from the locals. Fen paid tribute to the kingdom of men. Not much, but regularly. Every 3 months, a collector would come with a detachment of soldiers and take a quarter of the harvest. In return, he gave nothing. No protection, no law, no trade privileges. He just took it and left. If the village didn't pay, the next visit came with fire. Lissa said the next collection was in 6 weeks. Devon nodded. 6 weeks. It was both a long time and a short time. Long enough to prepare. Too short to become strong enough to stand up to a regular army. Borthan agreed on the 3rd day. Not out of friendship, out of calculation. 10 clay workers who built for free and didn't require food were an offer he couldn't refuse. Devon fashioned 10 workers from local clay and left them in Fen with simple instructions. Repair. Build. Help. The connection with them grew weaker with distance. Devon could sense them, but couldn't issue complex orders more than half a day's journey away. Another limitation that needed to be overcome. On the way back, Lissa walked beside him in silence. Then she spoke. She said Devon was playing a dangerous game, that a trade alliance with Fen was the first step toward becoming noticeable. As long as Muddle was a destitute backwater, they were ignored. Trade with Fen, walls, an army. Sooner or later, one of the 3 empires would take notice. Devon replied that that was exactly what he was counting on. But not now. Right now, he needed time. Lissa asked how much. Devon thought for a moment and said 3 months. 3 months to build a strong enough defense. 3 months to upgrade the units to Tier 2. 3 months to prepare for the first real clash. Not with a gang of 12 marauders, with a real army. Lissa looked at him for a long time and said he didn't have 3 months, that she knew how human intelligence worked, that the kingdom's tax collector would arrive in Fen in 6 weeks and see the clay workers, and that a week after that, it wouldn't be a collector, but a detachment arriving in Muddle. Devon didn't answer. He knew Lissa was right. 6 weeks, maybe 7. He had to cram 3 months of preparation into 6 weeks. In RTS, it was called going all in, an all-or-nothing gamble. Devon hated going all in. He was a macro player, a long-game player. But the long game is a luxury afforded only to those who have time. He didn't have time. Devon returned to Muddle and immediately rearranged his priorities. The economy took a back seat. The top priority was now military. More soldiers, better soldiers, faster. He increased the shifts at the kilns. 3 kilns worked nonstop. Tariq and the blacksmiths dropped all other projects and focused on frames for the soldiers. Devon was churning out 6 warriors a day. Each new one was slightly better than the last. He refined the shape, adjusted the proportions, experimented with the thickness of the armor. On the 45th day, Devon created something new, a clay archer. He had thought long and hard about it, A bow required precision that the clay servants lacked. Their movements were clumsy. Their fingers were clumsy. Drawing the bowstring and taking aim was nearly impossible for them. Devon solved the problem differently. He remembered the ability to absorb patterns. Lissa knew how to shoot a bow. Not like an elven archer, but well enough. Devon asked her to demonstrate. Lissa shot for 2 hours. Devon watched every movement, the grip, the draw, the angle, the moment of release. Then he sculpted the archer. Long arms, slender fingers, broad shoulders, a hollow chest so it wouldn't interfere with the bowstring. And he imprinted the image of Lissa shooting onto it. The clay archer raised a rough bow made by Tariq from swampwood. He drew the bowstring and drove an arrow into a log from 20 paces away, not in the center, but into the log. Lissa stood nearby and watched. Her face was inscrutable. Then she said quietly that it was frightening. Devon replied that was the intention. By the end of the 6th week, Devon stood on the wall and looked at his army. 40 clay infantry soldiers, 15 clay archers, 10 clay scouts, 150 workers, a 3-meter-high wall, a wide and deep moat, 2 rows of sharpened fired clay stakes in front of the moat, 3 watchtowers, a stockpile of clay projectiles on the walls. Devon knew this wasn't enough. Against a real army of the Kingdom of Men, with knights and mages, this was catastrophically insufficient. But it was all he'd managed to do in 6 weeks. And it was 1,000 times better than nothing. Lissa approached him and said that the scouts had returned from the south. A human tax collector was heading toward Fen. He had 50 soldiers with him, not 12 orc marauders, 50 trained fighters with swords and armor. Devon closed his eyes. 50. This was his first test of the second wave. His first real. He opened his eyes and began giving orders. Devon didn't wait for the human squad to reach Muddle. That was a mistake made by RTS newbies. They sit at their base and wait for the enemy to come to the gates. Champions play differently. They choose the battlefield themselves. Devon studied the map Lissa had drawn up. Between Fen and Muddle lay a narrow passage between 2 swamps. A path 10 paces wide. Quicksand on the right, quicksand on the left. The only dry path was a half-day's journey in either direction, an ideal defensive position. Devon set out at night. 40 soldiers, 15 archers, 30 workers. Lissa led the way as a guide. The rest of the forces remained in Muddle under simple standing orders. Devon could feel their presence in the back of his mind, but did not let it distract him. All his attention was here. They reached the passage by dawn. Devon immediately began building. 30 laborers dug like mad. Within 4 hours, a wall of wet clay, 1.5 meters high, had risen in front of the passage. Not a fortress, a barricade. In front of the wall, the workers dug in 3 rows of sharpened clay stakes. Behind the wall, Devon lined up the archers in 2 rows. The soldiers took up positions on the flanks, sheltered by the curves of the marshy bank. Devon climbed onto a mound behind the position from where he could see the entire passage. Lissa lay down beside him. She asked if he had ever seen the Royal Infantry fight. Devon replied that he hadn't. Lissa described it. Heavy infantry in chainmail, shields, swords, a wall of shields, discipline. The commander gives orders with his voice and gestures. Spearmen in the front row, swordsmen in the second. If there's a mage, he stands behind and casts area of effect spells. Devon asked if there would be a mage. Lissa said that the tax collector usually doesn't have mages. Mages are too valuable for collecting taxes from the villages. Devon nodded. One less problem. The human detachment arrived after noon. 52 soldiers. Devon counted them twice. The commander rode on horseback. The rest walked. Chainmail, shields, spears, and swords. Everything just as Lissa had described. Professional soldiers. Not marauders. Not a gang. Real soldiers of the kingdom. The commander saw the barricade and halted the detachment. He stared at the clay wall and the rows of stakes for a long time, then at the clay archers standing on the wall with their bows drawn. Then he ordered 3 soldiers to come closer and take a look. 3 scouts approached the barricade to within 30 paces. Devon waited. The scouts saw the clay archers and stopped. One of them shouted to the commander that there were clay figures with bows standing on the wall. The commander rode closer. He was not young, a scar across his left cheek. The eyes of a man who had fought for 20 years and was tired of it but had not forgotten how. He scanned Devon's position, and Devon saw a flash of professional respect in his eyes. The position was well constructed. The commander could see that. The commander shouted toward the barricade. He said he was Captain Reynold from the Duke of Vashton's garrison, that he was here on orders to collect tribute from the village of Fen, and that he demanded this filthy wall be removed from the road. Devon stood on a mound so he could be seen. He replied that the village of Fen was under Muddle's protection, that the tribute would no longer be collected, and that Captain Reynold had better turn around and leave. Silence. Then Reynold laughed, not maliciously, almost cheerfully. He said that in 20 years of service, this was the first time he'd been stopped by a wall of mud and an army of clay dolls, and that the boy had better get out of the way before he crushed his toys with his boots. Devon didn't answer. He simply raised his hand, and 15 clay archers simultaneously drew their bows, in unison, with a single motion. 15 arrowheads were aimed at the human squad. Reynolds stopped laughing. He'd seen this before, a coordinated volley. These weren't a child's dolls. These were controlled weapons. Reynolds gave the order, and his soldiers formed ranks, a wall of shields, spears forward, professional and swift. Devon assessed the situation. A good formation, tight. The shields protected their bodies from the arrows, but the passage was narrow. Only 8 fighters could fit in a row. That meant Reynolds couldn't attack with his full force. Only 8 against 8. And that played into Devon's hands. Reynolds ordered the advance. The first row moved forward, shields raised, spears pointed. 8 soldiers marched in even step toward the barricade. Devon gave the order to the archers. Not at the shields, aim for the legs. 15 arrows struck the ground in front of the formation. 3 hit the soldiers' legs below their shields. 2 fell. The formation faltered. Devon waited 2 seconds while the row hesitated and ordered a second volley. 4 more hits. The first row retreated, having lost 5 men. None were killed. The arrows with clay tips didn't pierce the chainmail, but a strike to an unprotected shin broke the leg, or at least put the soldier out of action. Reynolds frowned. He sent in the second row, this time at a run. Devon gave the order to the soldiers. 10 clay infantrymen rose from behind the barricade and lined up, blocking the passages. The human soldiers crashed into them at full speed. The first sword strike split a clay soldier in half. The second shattered another's arm. But the clay soldiers did not retreat. They did not scream. They were not afraid. The soldier split in 2, wrapped both fragments of his arms around the leg of the nearest man, and wouldn't let go. The soldier with the severed arm continued to press forward with his shield. Devon relayed commands between the units at a speed that would have been impossible for a living commander. He didn't shout orders. He didn't wait for an aide to relay the signal. Each clay soldier received the command instantly, directly into whatever meager mind it possessed. Turn, step left, block, grab, hold, make way for the archer behind you. The archers fired through the gaps between the soldiers. Devon coordinated every shot. A soldier took a step to the right. An archer shot into the gap that formed. The soldier stepped back. To the human fighters, it looked like a living wall that breathed and spat out arrows. Reynolds deployed the 3rd and 4th ranks simultaneously. 16 fighters struck the barricade at once. The clay wall cracked. 5 of Devon's soldiers crumbled to dust. Devon withdrew the remaining ones behind the second line. The workers leaped out from behind the mounds and clung to the legs of the human fighters who had broken through. Small, tenacious figures grabbed at ankles, belts, and scabbards. One worker weighed little. 5 workers on a single soldier were already an anchor. The men stumbled, fell, tried to shake off the clay workers, and took an arrow in the thigh while they struggled. The battle lasted 30 minutes. Devon lost 22 soldiers and 41 workers, more than half the forces he had brought with him. But Reynold lost only 11 fighters, all of whom were incapacitated. Not a single casualty, all wounded in the legs, all alive. Reynolds stood before the ruins of the barricade and looked out at the battlefield littered with shards of clay. His soldiers stood behind him, breathing heavily. They could continue. He had 40 combat-ready fighters left. Devon had 18 soldiers and 15 archers left. Reynolds could win, but at what cost? Devon stood on a mound, exposed, calm. He said that Reynolds could pass through what remained of the barricade. He could reach Fen. He could collect the tribute. But every time he came, the barricade would be higher, and there would be more clay soldiers. He said the clay was free. Reynolds' soldiers were not. Reynolds was silent for a long time. Then he ordered a retreat. He turned his unit around and led it south, without a word, without a threat. A professional soldier who understood the math. Devon lost the battle in terms of casualties. He lost more units than the enemy, but he won the campaign. Reynolds was gone. The tribute wasn't collected. Fen remained free. Devon sat down on the wet ground amid the rubble of the barricade. His legs were shaking. His head was buzzing with tension. Commanding 60 units in real combat turned out to be 100 times harder than in the game. In the game, units are pixels. Here, every fallen soldier echoed in his head as a painful click of a severed connection. Devon rubbed his temples and thought he needed to train. His brain had to be able to handle more. Lissa sat down next to him. She was silent. Then she said that Captain Reynolds would report to Duke Vashton, that the Duke would send more men, that next time there would be 200 instead of 50, and that there would be a mage. Devon nodded. He knew. The clock was ticking. Devon hadn't slept for 2 days after the battle with Reynolds. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to waste time. He was sculpting soldiers, one after another. By dawn of the second day, his fingers were rubbed raw. Clay clogged the cracks in his skin and stung. The body of the lad from Muddle protested, but Devon forced it to work. There's no pause button in an RTS. The enemy doesn't wait for you to rest. By the end of the second month, Devon's army had doubled in size. 80 infantry soldiers, 30 archers, 20 scouts, 200 workers. But Devon understood that quantity without quality was a road to nowhere. His first-tier clay soldiers wouldn't stand a chance against the Human Kingdom's mage. 1 fireball and a dozen soldiers would turn to shards. He needed a second tier. Devon gathered Tariq and 3 blacksmiths. He explained the task. The clay soldiers needed armor. Not external, internal. A multi-layered structure, like the shell of a mollusk. Layer upon layer. Air pockets between the layers. A blow destroys the outer layer, but is absorbed by the air pocket and doesn't reach the inner one. Tariq listened and nodded. He understood the principle. It was like forging. Folds in metal make a blade stronger. Folds in clay could make a soldier stronger. They experimented for a week. The first multi-layered soldiers fell apart during drying. Cracks ran along the boundaries of the layers. Tariq suggested adding thin strips of fabric between the layers as reinforcement. Devon tried it. Fabric was in short supply in Muddle, but the herbalist Hestha knew how to weave a coarse thread from marsh sedge. Workers began gathering sedge. Other workers wove the thread. Still others wove strips of coarse fabric. A fourth group placed them between the layers of clay while shaping the soldiers. Devon watched this assembly line and recognized a familiar pattern: the production chain. Raw material extraction leads to processing. Processing leads to production. Production leads to a finished unit. Classic RTS economics. The first multi-layered soldier that didn't fall apart appeared on the 62nd day. Devon called it the second run unit. Tariq struck it with a hammer. The outer layer cracked. The inner layer remained intact. The soldier didn't even waver. Devon struck it in the chest with a stick. The stick broke. Devon smiled. Now he needed to scale up production. 10 second-tier soldiers a day. That was the plan. But the plan required resources they lacked. Cloth, stone for the frames, wood for bows and arrows. Devon needed to expand. He sent Lissa to negotiate with 2 other villages that the scouts had discovered. Holt in the southeast, a small fishing village on the riverbank, and Bray in the west, a village of lumberjacks on the edge of a no-man's-land forest. Lissa left with 5 clay workers as a demonstration. She returned 10 days later. Both villages had agreed. The terms were the same as with Fen, clay workers in exchange for resources and mutual protection. Devon now controlled 4 settlements: Muddle, Fen, Holt, and Bray. Clay workers toiled in all 4. Wood came from Bray, fish from Holt, iron from Fen, clay from Muddle. Trade routes between the villages were guarded by clay patrols. Devon looked at the map in his mind and saw a classic model of expansion: a central base and 3 satellites. Each satellite supplied a unique resource. The roads were secure. The economy is diversified. It was at this very moment that Devon first noticed something strange in Golem 1's behavior. Devon had sculpted his first servant on the day he arrived in Muddle. More than 2 months had passed since then. All the other servants from the first batch had long since fallen apart or been destroyed. But one was still working. Devon noticed that one moved differently from the others. All the workers carried out orders mechanically: dig, carry, place. One also dug and carried and placed, but between orders he did something the others didn't do. He stopped, and he looked. He had no eyes in the human sense, just 2 indentations on his smooth clay head. But Devon sensed through their connection that Odin was aware of his surroundings, that he could tell people apart from the workers, that he recognized Devon among the rest. Once, Devon watched as one carried a clay brick toward the wall. Another worker bumped into him and dropped his brick. An ordinary worker would have walked past. One stopped. He set his brick on the ground. He picked up the other man's. He handed it to the worker he'd bumped into. And only then did he pick up his own and walk on his way. Devon froze. It wasn't an order. Devon hadn't given the command to pick up the other man's brick. One did it on his own. Initiative. The beginnings of independent action. Devon walked over to one and stared at him for a long time. A small, crooked figure. The first pancake. The roughest and most primitive of all his creations. And the only one who had begun to think. Or something resembling thought. Devon mentally assigned one the status of an observed object. Not a unit. Not just a worker. Something else. Something he did not yet understand. On the 70th day, 2 events occurred simultaneously. The first. Scouts from the south reported that Duke Vashtian was assembling a punitive expedition. 200 soldiers. And a mage. Lissa was right. Second. Scouts from the northwest stopped communicating. All 5 of them. At the same time. Devon felt 5 points in his consciousness go dark at once. Not one after another. All at once. This meant that someone had wiped out the 5 scouts in a single strike. Human soldiers don't operate that way. Orcs don't either. Only someone who knows what they're looking for and strikes with precision operates that way. Devon told Lissa about this. Lissa turned pale. She said that if all 5 scouts were eliminated simultaneously while separated from one another, it meant they'd been tracked down. Someone had been hunting them down deliberately. Someone who knew Devon was sending out scouts. Someone who was watching him. Devon asked who. Lissa replied that there were 2 possibilities, either spies from the human kingdom or someone worse, the elves. Devon fell silent. The elves had been a blank spot on his map until now. He knew almost nothing about them. The Forest Empire didn't send raiding parties or collect tribute from unclaimed villages. They simply watched, silently, from the heights of their 1,000-year-old trees. And that was more frightening than orc raids and human swords. Devon decided not to panic. 2 threats. A human punitive expedition in a few weeks. An unknown observer right now. In RTS, this is a standard mid-game situation. Pressure from two sides. The response is standard 2. Fortify. Scale up production. Don't spread yourself too thin. And don't make the first move until you know the situation. Devon ordered a doubling of second-tier soldier production. He ordered Tariq to begin work on siege structures. Not for attack, for defense. Heavy clay ballistas firing clay projectiles. Rough, primitive, but effective against dense infantry formations. Devon stood by the window of his hut and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the swamps and forests, 3 empires went about their business. Thousands of years of war, millions of soldiers, magic, technology, diplomacy. And here, on a patch of swampy land, stood a guy from another world, molding an army out of mud. The scale of the disparity was absurd. But Devon knew one thing that every RTS champion knows. Scale doesn't matter. What matters is pace. Whoever develops faster wins. Always. Regardless of starting conditions. The human punitive expedition arrived on the 83rd day. 212 soldiers, cavalry, infantry, and a mage. Lissa saw them first. She was standing on the watchtower counting the banners. Blue with a silver griffin. Duke Vashton. Devon climbed onto the wall. The human army stretched along the road from the horizon to the nearest hill. Spears glinted in the morning light. The cavalry led the way. Behind them, the infantry in 3 columns. And at the rear, on horseback in a dark blue cloak, a figure with a staff. The mage. Devon quickly assessed his forces. 60 second-tier soldiers, 40 first-tier soldiers, 30 archers, 300 laborers, a 3-meter wall, a moat, pickets, 3 towers with ballistas. In terms of numbers, he was slightly outmatched. In terms of quality, catastrophically so. 1 human knight was worth 10 clay soldiers. The mage was worth 100. Devon closed his eyes and began to think. Not as a commander, as a player. In an RTS, when you're attacked by superior forces, there are 3 options. First, defend the fortress. Force the enemy to storm the fortifications and pay in blood for every meter. Second, maneuver warfare. Avoid a decisive battle. Strike and retreat. Wear them down. Third, economic strangulation. Attack not the army, but the supply lines. Devon chose a combination of the first and third. The human army was far from base. Their supply lines were stretched thin. They brought supplies for a week, maybe 2. If they don't take muddle quickly, they'll start to starve. Devon had no intention of letting them take muddle quickly. The human commander turned out not to be Reynold. Another man, younger, more vicious, a knight in full armor on a warhorse. Devon learned his name later from Lissa, Sir Aldrich, the Duke's nephew Vashton, young and ambitious, sent to deal with the rebellious village to earn glory through an easy victory. Aldrich rode up to the walls of Muddle and looked up. Devon stood on the wall next to one. The small, crooked figure of the first clay servant looked ridiculous next to the 3-meter wall and the rows of soldiers. But one stood there because he wanted to. Devon hadn't ordered him. One had come on his own. Aldrich declared that the village of Muddle had violated the law of the kingdom, that the tribute had not been paid, that the illegal army must be disbanded, and that the villagers had 1 hour to open the gates and lay down their weapons. Devon replied that Muddle did not belong to the kingdom, that no man's land belonged to those who defended it, and that he had no intention of opening the gates. Aldrich smirked and turned his horse around. 1 hour. Devon used every minute. Workers reinforced the weak sections of the wall. Archers took up their positions. Soldiers lined up behind the gates in 3 echelons. Ballistae on the towers were loaded with clay projectiles. Devon sent 20 workers outside the walls through an underground passage that had been dug during the third week of construction. The passage led to a swamp 300 meters from the southern wall. 20 workers emerged from the mud and lay in wait among the mounds. Devon left them without orders. A reserve. A trump card up his sleeve. The Lud army attacked an hour later. Aldrich didn't mess around. He sent the infantry in a direct assault. 3 columns of 30 men each struck the northern wall. Ladders, grappling hooks, a professional assault by the book. Devon met them with a volley of archers, 30 arrows at once. The clay arrowheads didn't pierce the shields, but those carrying the ladders couldn't hold their shields. 5 fell. The ladders toppled. The second wave grabbed the ladders and began climbing again. Devon ordered the soldiers on the wall to throw the climbers down. Clay hands pushed the ladders away from the wall. Human soldiers fell into the moat filled with water and stakes. Screams, splashing, dull thuds. The assault lasted 2 hours. Aldrich sent column after column. Devon was losing soldiers on the wall. Human swords split the clay bodies. But for every one that fell, a new one took its place. Workers from the rear brought spare weapons and clay blocks to repair the wall right in the middle of the battle. Aldrich was losing his patience. He ordered the mage. Devon saw a figure in a blue cloak raise a staff. The air hummed. Devon felt it in his skin. Pressure, heat, mana concentrated at the tip of the staff like a glowing sphere. A fireball. Devon knew what would happen next. The sphere would fly into the wall, or the gate, or a cluster of soldiers, and dozens of clay figures would crumble from the heat like dry leaves. Devon gave an order no one expected. 30 workers on the wall simultaneously leaped down, outward, toward the human army. They flew from a height of 3 meters like a rain of clay. The little figures fell onto the heads of the storming soldiers. They grabbed at their hands, their helmets, their weapons. They created chaos. The human soldiers began to fight off the workers clinging to them. The formation broke down. The humans mingled with the clay figures in a chaotic heap. The mage froze. He couldn't strike the crowd with fire when his own men were mixed in with the clay figures. Devon had bought 3 minutes. 3 minutes during which the archers fired 4 more volleys at the disorganized crowd. 3 minutes during which the soldiers on the wall regrouped. 3 minutes during which 20 workers from the underground passage flanked the human army from the south and began attacking the supply train. The supply train. Supplies, tents, horses. 20 small clay figures attacked the Duke's army's supply train and began smashing everything in sight. They slashed sacks of grain. They overturned water barrels. They frightened the horses. Panic in the rear. Aldrich learned of the attack on the supply train and roared with rage. He sent the cavalry back to rescue the supplies. 20 workers stood no chance against the cavalry. They were trampled within minutes. But the damage was done. Half the supplies were destroyed. 3 horses had run away. 2 tents were burning from an overturned campfire. Devon had sacrificed 50 workers in this battle. Small fry. Cheap. Endless. The human army lost 23 soldiers wounded and half their supplies. The mage never fired a shot. Aldrich led the army to a hill and set up camp. A siege. Devon stood on the wall and watched the fires of the human camp. They hadn't left, but they hadn't won. Aldrich was young and proud. He wouldn't leave until he took Muddle. But Devon was already counting the days. Aldrich had supplies for 5 days at most. Devon had an endless supply of clay. Time was on the potter's side. Devon molded new workers and soldiers all night. By morning, he had as much strength as he had before the battle. Aldrich would never have that much. That was the essence of Devon's economy. His losses were free. The enemy's losses were irreplaceable. The siege lasted 7 days. Aldrich stormed the walls twice more. Each time, Devon met him with the same tactics: archers on the walls, soldiers in the breaches, workers in chaotic counterattacks, and sabotage in the rear through underground tunnels. Devon dug 2 more tunnels during the siege. The workers dug quietly and methodically, 24 hours a day. Every night, small groups of workers emerged from the ground behind the human camp and sabotaged everything they could reach. They soaked the gunpowder. They cut the straps on the saddles. They filled the wells with clay. Petty acts of mischief that meant nothing on their own, but together they drove the human army mad. The soldiers didn't sleep. Every rustle in the darkness could be an attack by clay dwarves. The mage Aldrich burned 2 underground passages on the 4th day. He sensed the voids beneath the ground and brought the vaults crashing down with fire. Devon lost 30 workers in the tunnels, but the mage didn't find the 3rd passage. Devon changed the exit points every night. On the 5th day, Aldrich tried a starvation siege, surround and wait. But Muddle stood on the swamp. The swamp provided water and fish. The gardens outside the walls provided vegetables. The clay workers didn't eat. Devon could sit outside the walls for months. Aldrich couldn't. His soldiers were chewing on their last hardtack. The horses stood without oats. Morale was falling. On the 6th day, 3 of Aldrich's soldiers deserted at night. They just left. In the morning, Aldrich would have executed them as an example if he'd caught them. But there was no one to catch them. Everyone was busy trying not to fall asleep and miss the next sortie by the clay dwarves. On the 7th day, Aldrich demanded negotiations. Devon went out through the gate, alone, without guards. It was risky. One swing of a sword and the clay army would fall silent. But Devon understood that Aldrich was a knight, and knights don't kill negotiators, at least not in front of witnesses. Aldrich stood before him in crumpled armor, dirty, angry, humiliatingly hungry. He said he was ready to leave, but that Devon must understand the consequences. Duke Vashton would not forgive. The kingdom would not forgive, Devon replied calmly. He said he understood, and that he was offering Duke Vashton a deal. Muddle and the allied villages would not pay tribute. In return, they would not attack the kingdom's territory, and they would open a trade route through the no man's land. Trade instead of tribute. The Duke gets goods, Devon gets peace. Aldrich smirked. He said that Devon was asking for too much for a village boy with an army of clay dolls. Devon replied that his army of dolls had just held their ground against 200 soldiers of the kingdom for 7 days, and that next time there would be more dolls. Aldrich turned and walked away, without answering. The human army broke camp that same day. They left in silence. Devon watched from the tower as 200 soldiers trudged down the road to the south, 23 stretchers carrying the wounded, exhausted faces, empty carts where the supplies had been. Victory. The first real victory over the regular army of a great power. Muddle rejoiced. The villagers poured onto the walls and shouted with joy. Children ran between the clay soldiers and touched their hands. Old Man Pole was crying. He had lived 60 years and had never seen a village on no man's land defeat the kingdom's army. Mela approached Devon and took his hand firmly. She said she didn't know who he was or where he came from, but that now she believed. Devon nodded. He didn't feel joy. He felt the clock ticking in his head. The 7-day siege had given him time, but it had also given the entire continent information. The village of Muddle had repelled the human kingdom's army. This news would spread. Humans will find out. Orcs will find out. Elves will find out. The window for quiet development had closed. Devon was no longer invisible. He was the 4th player on the board, and all 3 others were now looking his way. Devon didn't waste time celebrating. For the next 3 weeks, he worked with an intensity that even frightened Lissa. He tripled production, new furnaces, new quarries, new workshops. Tariq got assistance from Fen and Bray. 6 blacksmiths worked on the soldiers' frames. Weavers from Holt wove sedge for reinforcement. Devon began work on the 3rd batch of units. Siege golems. Big ones. Heavy. twice the height of a human, massive arms capable of breaking down walls, thick, multi-layered armor with a stone frame, slow but nearly invulnerable to ordinary weapons. The first siege golem took a whole day to build. Devon sculpted it alone, layer by layer. A frame of river stones fitted by Tariq, 3 layers of clay with fabric reinforcement, fired in a special oversized kiln. The golem stood at sunset, 3 meters tall, arms as thick as logs, legs like columns. On its smooth head, 2 indentations where the eyes should be. Devon gave the order to move. The golem took a step. The ground shook. A second step. A third. Each step echoed with a deep thud. The wall next to which the golem was walking cracked from the vibration. Devon stopped him. It needed refinement. Too heavy, too clumsy. It was destroying its own fortifications as it walked. Tariq suggested making the feet wider to distribute the weight. Devon agreed. By the end of the 3rd month, Devon took stock. 100 second-tier soldiers, 20 first-tier soldiers on garrison duty, 50 archers, 30 scouts, 4 siege golems, 400 workers, 4 villages in the alliance, trade routes, supply chains. The population of the no man's land under his control had reached 300 people. Devon proclaimed the creation of the Clay Kingdom on the 90th day. Not loudly, not ceremoniously. He simply gathered the elders of the 4 villages and said that from now on they were one, that each village would retain self-governance, that Devon would protect them all, that no one would pay tribute. Mela became head of the civil council. Tariq was given the title of chief engineer. Lissa led intelligence and diplomacy. Court became the instructor for the militia of living volunteers. A small, impoverished kingdom in the swamps. No gold, no magic, no great warriors, only clay. Endless, malleable clay, and a guy from another world who knew how to turn mud into an empire. Devon stood on the Muddle Tower and looked out over his domain. 4 villages, walls, workshops, fields. Clay workers scurried everywhere like ants. Soldiers stood on the walls, motionless and patient. One stood nearby, small, crooked, the first. Devon looked at him and noticed that one was standing slightly ahead, between Devon and the edge of the tower, shielding him from a possible arrow from the ground. Devon hadn't ordered him to. One had positioned himself that way on his own. The continent took notice of the Clay Kingdom in the 4th month. Not immediately, and not all at once. The orcs were the first to react. Chieftain Goruk ruled the largest clan of the Horde, 3,000 warriors. He controlled the northwestern steppes and considered the no man's land his hunting grounds. The news that some little human from the swamp had repelled a human army with clay dolls reached Goruk 2 weeks after Aldrich's retreat. Goruk didn't believe it. Then he sent a dozen scouts to check it out. The scouts returned a week later and confirmed it. In the no man's land stands a fortified city with clay walls. Clay soldiers patrol around it. Workers are building roads and bridges. 4 villages have been united. Devon learned about the orc scouts from Lissa. Her spy network had grown along with the kingdom. 3 former deserters from different armies had joined Muddle over the past month. Lissa turned them into agents. They sat in the taverns of border towns and listened. Lissa said that Goruk was curious but not concerned. To him, the Clay Kingdom was a funny story. Mud playing at being an army. He wouldn't take it seriously until he saw it with his own eyes. Devon nodded. That was good. The longer he isn't taken seriously, the more time they have to develop. The people were the second to react. Duke Vashton received Aldrich's report and flew into a rage. His nephew had been disgraced. His soldiers had been beaten by a bunch of peasants. But Vashton was a politician before he was a military man. He did not send a second army. Instead, he sent an envoy. The envoy arrived on the 100th day, a gaunt man in an expensive doublet, his clothes soaked with horse mud. He looked around Muddle with disgust and asked for an audience with the one in command here. Devon received him in the only stone building they had managed to construct, the council hall, a small room with a clay table and clay chairs. On the walls stood 4 second-rate clay soldiers, motionless, silent, with blank faces turned toward the guest. The ambassador grew nervous. Devon offered him a seat. The ambassador conveyed Duke Vashton's proposal, a reduced tribute, half of what it used to be. In exchange, the Duke would recognize Muddle's autonomy and not send troops. Devon listened and made a counterproposal. No tribute, a trade agreement. Muddle would supply ceramics and clay goods. The Duke would open the market. A fair exchange. The ambassador said the Duke does not trade with villages. Devon replied that Muddle is no longer a village. The ambassador looked at the clay soldiers by the walls, at the one by the door. This soldier stood differently from the rest. He wasn't frozen at attention. He stood freely, almost relaxed, like a living guard, not a statue. It was one. The ambassador asked what kind of creature it was. Devon said it was his advisor. The ambassador turned pale and left that very day. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived from Vashton. The Duke accepted the trade agreement. Not out of kindness, out of calculation. War with the Clay army was costly and brought no glory. Trade was cheap and brought in revenue. Devon signed the Clay Kingdom's first diplomatic document, a piece of parchment with a seal made of fired clay. First diplomatic victory. Devon mentally checked it off. The southern flank was stabilized, but there were still 2 other flanks. The orcs hadn't sent an envoy, they'd sent a military detachment. 200 orcs under the command of Goruk's youngest son, a young, ambitious orc named Crag. Crag hadn't come to plunder, he'd come to observe. 200 orcs set up camp 3 hours' walk from Muddle and began hunting marsh game, ostentatiously, showing that they were here and didn't give a damn about the mud walls. Devon watched through his scouts. Lissa suggested 2 options: ignore them and wait for them to leave, or make contact. Devon chose a third option. He sent 20 clay workers to the orc camp, unarmed, without a threat. 20 little figures arrived at the camp and began building, right in front of the astonished orcs. The workers stacked stones into a neat hearth, dug a ditch to drain water, built a windbreak, improved the orc camp. Crag watched this and didn't know what to do. His warriors wanted to crush the little clay freaks. Crag forbade it. He was the chieftain's son. He knew how to think. The clay workers were building for the orcs, for free, without being asked. It wasn't an attack. It was something the orcs had never seen before, a gesture. The next day, Devon came to the orc camp in person, with Lissa and with One. One walked beside Devon in small steps. The orcs stared at him. Crag sat by the fire the clay workers had built for him. He was enormous. 2 meters of muscles and fangs, green skin with a gray sheen, yellow eyes, intelligent. Crag asked why Devon had come. Devon replied that he wanted to trade. Crag laughed. He said that orcs don't trade. Orcs take. Devon said he knew that, and that was exactly why orcs had no walls, no roads, no cities, no smithies, nothing but strength. And strength without an economy is a sword without a hilt. It shines beautifully. It's uncomfortable to hold. Crag stopped laughing. No one had ever said that to his face. Devon continued. He proposed a trade. Clay workers for the horde. Builders, diggers, porters. Free labor that doesn't eat or sleep. In return, the orcs would not attack the territory of the Clay Kingdom, and they would sell iron ore from their steppe mines. Crag thought for a long time. Then he said his father would decide. Devon nodded. He hadn't expected an immediate answer, but the seed had been sown. Crag led his people away 3 days later, without incident. 20 clay workers remained in the abandoned camp and waited. Devon didn't take them. He left them as a sign. like an open door. Devon returned to Muddle and turned his attention to the third flank, the elves. The elves were the most difficult. They sent neither envoys, nor armies, nor scouts. At least, no visible scouts. The 5 destroyed Clay scouts in the northeast remained unexplained. Lissa said that elves never make the first move. They observe, they analyze, they wait, sometimes for decades. Then they act once, and decisively. Devon wasn't happy with that. In an RTS, a passive player is dangerous because you don't know their build. They might be stockpiling an army. They can develop technologies. They can prepare a strike you won't see until it hits. Devon decided to provoke contact. He sent a single clay worker to the edge of the elven forest. One, small, unarmed, with a piece of white cloth tied to his arm, a primitive white flag. The worker reached the edge of the forest and stopped. Devon could sense him through the connection. Alive, unharmed, waiting. A day passed. 2, 3. On the 4th day, the connection with the worker didn't break. It changed. Devon sensed something new. An intrusion. Someone was touching his worker. Not physically, magically. Someone was studying the clay figure, analyzing its structure, reading the creator's traces. Devon felt a chill run down his spine. The elves hadn't just found his worker, they were scanning him. Through the workpiece, they were studying Devon, his class, his abilities, his crafting technique. Devon immediately severed the connection with the workpiece. The figurine at the edge of the forest froze and became nothing more than a lump of clay. Devon stood in his room, breathing heavily. They had found him. The elves knew more about him than he wanted them to. The question was what they intended to do with that knowledge. The answer came a week later. Not an army, not an ambassador, a letter. A small scroll of silvery parchment appeared on Devon's desk that morning. No one saw who brought it. No one heard footsteps. The scroll was simply there. Devon unrolled it. The text was in the common language of Korhast. Neat handwriting. Every letter was a work of calligraphy. The letter was from Silwen, Empress of the Elves. She wrote that she knew about Devon, knew about his class, knew he wasn't local, and knew that the Claymaker class wasn't what people thought it was. The last line made Devon read it 3 times. She wrote that 1,000 years ago, 3 empires conspired to destroy the memory of what Claymaker is capable of, and that Devon was the first in 1,000 years to awaken what was meant to sleep forever. Silwen's letter wouldn't leave Devon's mind for 3 days. He reread it over and over. The Claymaker class isn't trash, it's sealed. 3 empires conspired to erase the memory of it 1,000 years ago. Devon sat in the council chamber and thought. In RTS games, there are hidden mechanics, abilities that developers have hidden from players, abilities that seem weak until you find the right combination. Then they break the game. Devon felt he was on the verge of such a combination. But Silwen's letter wasn't a gift. It was a trap. The Elven Empress wouldn't share information for nothing. She wanted something. She wanted Devon to start digging, to start searching, to start experimenting with the class's forgotten capabilities. And then she would see what he was capable of. Reconnaissance disguised as assistance. Devon knew this trick. In RTS tournaments, experienced players throw their opponents a false advantage so they'll reveal their strategy. But Devon couldn't ignore the information, even if it was a trap. He began experimenting that very night. Until now, Devon had created servants using a single method. He'd sculpt the form. He entered a command through the system. The servant came to life, simple and crude. Now, Devon tried something different. He took a handful of clay and didn't shape it. He just held it in his hands and listened. For the first time in 4 months, he wasn't commanding the clay. He was listening to it. And the clay responded. Not with words, not with images, with a sensation. A deep, heavy rumble that came from beneath the earth, through his palms, into his chest, and on into his head. Devon felt the scale of it. The clay was everywhere, not just on the surface, not just in the swamp around Muddle. The clay layer went hundreds of meters deep and stretched in all directions.
beneath the elven forests, beneath the orc steppes, beneath the human cities. The entire continent of Korhast stood on clay. Devon opened his hands and dropped the handful onto the ground. He was shaking. He understood why the three empires were afraid. A clay worker doesn't just mold little soldiers out of mud. A clay worker connects to the foundation of the world, to all the clay on the continent. If you develop this connection far enough, you don't have to mold servants one by one. You can raise them straight from the ground, by the thousands. Devon didn't sleep until morning.
He sat on the ground and tried again. He listened to the clay. He reached out to it. The system responded, but slowly, as if something were getting in the way, as if a wall stood between Devon and the class's full power. Sealed. Silwyn had written the truth. The class was sealed. Not destroyed, not deleted, sealed precisely. Someone 1,000 years ago had set a limit. Devon could mold servants with his hands. He could control them. He could specialize them. But direct contact with the continent's clay was blocked, like a locked tech tree in a game. Devon knew that a key was needed to unlock it. In the morning, he gathered a council. Mela, Tariq, Lissa, Court, and Odin. Odin stood by the wall as usual, but Devon noticed that he was listening, tilting his head when someone spoke, turning toward the speaker, as if alive. Devon told the council about Silwyn's letter. Not everything, only that the Claymaker class was stronger than believed, and that the three empires had deliberately buried knowledge of it. Mela turned pale. She said that in the village legends there is a story about the first Shaper, an ancient being who created the world from clay. Devon asked her to tell it. Mela spoke slowly, recalling the words she had heard from her grandmother. The first Shaper was the creator god of Korhast. He molded the continent out of the void. Then he molded the creatures that inhabited it. Humans from white clay, orcs from gray, elves from gold. All of Korhast's races were created from clay. Then the Shaper grew tired, or died, or left. The legends differed, but his body became earth, his flesh became clay. The entire continent is the creator's dust. Devon was silent for a long time after Male's story. Then he said quietly that he now understood why his class had been sealed. If the potter can work with the clay from which all races are made, then he can do more than just create servants. He can create life, real life, in the same way that all the inhabitants of Korhast were created. Devon looked at the one. A small, crooked figure stood by the wall and looked at him. Without eyes, without a face, but Devon felt the gaze. The one was the first. Quote, the first to develop something resembling consciousness. Not because Devon had fashioned him better, because Devon had poured more attention and control into him than into any other. And the clay responded. The clay always responded. Devon stepped out of the hall and stood on the wall of muddle. Beneath him lay a continent of the gods' clay. Behind him stood an army made of that clay. Ahead lay three empires, each created from the same material as his soldiers. Devon closed his eyes and thought that this was the craziest game he had ever played, and that the stakes had just risen from a territorial dispute to the question of the nature of life. By the end of the 4th month, Devon received another piece of news. Goruk had responded to Crag's proposal. The orc chieftain had rejected the trade deal. Instead, he was assembling an army. 5,000 warriors. Goruk had decided that the growing clay kingdom was a threat that needed to be crushed while it was still small. Devon stood over the map and did the math. 5,000 orcs. He had 300 soldiers, 4 golems, 500 workers, a 15-to-1 ratio. In an RTS, such a ratio can only be overcome by technological superiority or a perfect position. Devon had neither. He needed 6 months to prepare for such a war. He had 2. Devon prepared for war with the orcs as if it were the final round of a tournament. 2 months. Every day scheduled down to the hour. Every resource accounted for. Every worker counted. First, fortifications. Devon rebuilt Muddle's defenses from a circular to an echelon formation. 3 lines of defense. The first line far from the walls, moats, traps, and mined areas. Clay mines. Hollow balls of fired clay filled with sharp shards and buried in the ground. When stepped on, they burst and the shards strike the legs. This was particularly effective against barefoot orcs. Second line. Field fortifications. Low brick walls behind which archers stood, arranged in a zigzag so that attackers would come under crossfire. Third line. The Muddle wall itself, now 4 meters high, with towers, with ballistas, with a supply of clay projectiles for a week of continuous firing. Second, the army. Devon switched to round-the-clock production. 3 shifts of blacksmiths, 6 forges, an assembly line. By the end of the 5th month, he had 500 second-tier soldiers, 10 siege golems, 100 archers, 600 workers. Still 10 times fewer than the orc army. But Devon wasn't planning to win by numbers. Third, tactics. Devon came up with something new. He called it waves. The first wave of defense. Workers in clay mines and traps. Slow down and disorganize. The second wave. Archers behind field fortifications. Thin out and wear down. Third wave. Soldiers on the walls. Stop and crush. Fourth wave. Golems in a counterattack. Break and put to flight. 4 waves, each subsequent one stronger than the last. The orcs would break through one line of defense only to run into the next, each time thinking they've broken through. Every time they're wrong. Devon knew the orc tactics. Lissa had described them dozens of times. Orcs attack en masse, all together, one huge horde. No flanks, no reserves, no maneuvering. A Zerg rush in its purest form. And Devon knew how to play against a Zerg rush. Walls, choke points, layered defenses, a strong economy behind him. But Devon was also preparing something beyond pure military tactics. Diplomacy. Lissa went to Goruk disguised as a merchant, not to Goruk himself, to his eldest son, Drouth. Drouth hated his younger brother, Crag, a classic struggle for the inheritance. Goruk is old. When he dies, power will pass to one of his sons. Crag wanted war because victory would bring him glory and the support of the clans. Drouth wanted peace because war would weaken the horde and strengthen the position of the humans and elves. Lissa found Drouth and relayed Devon's offer to him. If Drouth could convince some of the clans not to march on Muddle, Devon would support his claim to power after Goruk's death. Clay workers for construction, clay soldiers for guard duty, economic aid. Drouth listened and said nothing, but he didn't refuse either. Devon didn't expect Drouth to openly betray his father, but he did expect some of the clans to hesitate, that 5,000 would turn into 4, or 3. Every 1,000 that didn't come was 1,000 orcs that wouldn't need to be killed. While Devon was preparing for war with the orcs, something unexpected happened with the One. On the 150th day, Devon woke up to a sensation he couldn't describe. The connection with One was pulsing. Not like usual. Usually the connection was a steady thread, thin and constant. Now it was vibrating. Devon stepped out of the hut and found One in the square. A small clay figure stood before a pile of raw clay and was sculpting. One was sculpting a figure out of clay, a small one, crooked, resembling himself. Devon stopped and held his breath. The One had never been ordered to sculpt. Creating servants was Devon's ability, his class privilege. No one else could breathe life into clay. But the One was trying. His little fingers awkwardly kneaded the clay, shaping it. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. Devon stepped closer and crouched down beside him. One stopped, turned his head toward Devon, and Devon felt something through the connection that took his breath away. A request, not an order, not an instinct, a conscious request. One wanted to create, wanted to be not only created, but also a creator. Devon slowly reached out and touched the figure one was sculpting. He imbued it with a spark through the system. The figure stirred, stood up on its crooked little legs. One looked at it, and Devon felt through the connection something he hadn't expected. Joy. Not human, not complete, a shadow of joy, an echo of an emotion that a lump of clay shouldn't have. Devon sat in the square and watched Odin, the very first one, the small, crooked figure that in 5 months had transformed from a mindless unit into a being capable of desire, capable of asking, capable of joy. In an RTS, units don't feel. They're pixels on a screen. Here, they were the clay of the creator god, and this clay remembered what it meant to be alive. Devon realized in that moment that he wasn't just building a kingdom, he was creating a race, a new race, the hordes, the fifth after humans, orcs, elves, and what came before them, the clay people. Devon stood up and looked at his hands, the hands of a potter, hands that had molded soldiers, workers, and builders. Now he understood that he had been molding something greater. Every servant he created was a seed of new life in the old clay, and one was the first sprout. That evening, Devon issued an order no one expected. He ordered the clay servants to be renamed the Clay People. In the documents of the Clay Kingdom, in official communications, in everything, not servants, not units, a people. Maella asked why. Devon replied that it was because it was the truth. The orc army arrived on the 170th day. Not 5,000, 3.5. Lys's diplomacy had worked. 1,500 warriors from the clans loyal to Drouth did not show up for muster. Goruk was furious, but could not delay the march for the sake of internal squabbles. He marched with what he had. 3,500 orcs stretched across the steppe like a green sea. Devon stood on the main tower of Muddle and looked out at the horizon filled with banners. Even 3,500 was 7 times larger than his army. Goruk rode at the front, huge even by orc standards, over 2 meters tall, iron armor scarred from hundreds of battles, an axe the size of a man. He halted the army before Devon's first line of defense and surveyed the field. Moats, pikes, low, zigzagging walls. And behind it all, a city of clay with walls, towers, and rows of soldiers on them. Goruk spat and told his captains he would crush this filth by sunset. He was wrong. The first wave of orcs surged forward, 1,000 warriors, with a roar and a crash. They reached the front line, and the ground beneath them exploded. Dozens of clay mines burst under their feet. Shrapnel sliced into bare feet and shins. Orcs didn't wear boots. Their feet were as hard as soles, but the sharp, scorched clay cut even them. The first 1,000 slowed down. They didn't stop. Orcs don't stop. But they slowed down and came under fire from archers behind field fortifications. 100 clay archers fired a volley, then a second, a third, a fourth. Devon coordinated each archer individually. Not a single arrow flew into a shield. All hit unprotected areas, necks, arms, thighs, eyes. Devon selected targets with the cold efficiency of a player controlling snipers in a tactical shooter. The orcs lost 100 on the front line, not killed, wounded, taken out of action. They broke through the field fortifications in 20 minutes. They crushed the walls, trampled the archers. Devon showed no mercy to the archers on the second line. They were expendable, like the workers thrown at the orcs in the first battle, to hold them back, to wear them down, thin them out. It cost a lot, but they accomplished the task. The second wave of orcs struck the main wall. 3,000. A roar, a rumble, ladders, hooks, bare hands clung to the clay bricks and broke them. 500 soldiers from the second line met them on the wall. Devon commanded each one. 500 simultaneous streams of commands. His head was splitting. Blood ran from his nose. The body of the lad from Muddle wasn't built for such a strain. But the brain of an RTS champion held. Each soldier received an individual command. Block on the left, push to the right, retreat a step, strike, grab, hold. 500 soldiers moved as a single organism. For the orcs, it was like fighting the sea. Every clay soldier killed was replaced by a new one. Workers from the rear dragged fresh soldiers, molded by Devon between commands, up to the walls. He was sculpting and commanding at the same time. His left hand kneaded the clay, his right directed the battle. His brain was torn in two. Goruk watched for 2 hours. His army was bogged down in Devon's defense like a foot in a swamp. Every meter cost blood. The clay soldiers were endless. For every one killed, a new one took his place. The wall was being repaired faster than it was being broken. Workers hauled bricks and patched the breaches right under the swords. Goruk couldn't take it anymore. He went himself. The horde chieftain grabbed his axe and ran toward the wall. 3 meters of fury and steel. He leaped onto the wall in a single bound. He cleared the moat. He clung the edge, pulled himself up, and found himself face to face with 10 clay soldiers. Goruk cut down the first 3 with a single blow. The axe sliced through the clay bodies like pottery. Shards scattered across the wall. 3 more rushed at him. Goruk knocked them down. 4 more. Goruk fought like a machine. The axe worked without stopping. Devon threw soldiers at him one after another, not to win, to delay him, to wear him down, to force him to expend his strength. Goruk killed 30 clay soldiers in 10 minutes, and he grew tired. He didn't stop. He slowed down, for half a second. Devon had been waiting for this moment. 10 siege golems emerged from behind the wall, 3 meters tall each, arms like logs, legs like columns. The ground shook with their footsteps. Goruk saw them and, for the first time in the battle, stopped attacking. He stood on the wall, covered in clay dust, and watched as 10 giants marched toward him. Devon didn't throw the golems at Goruk. He directed them past, through the breaches in the wall, outward, into the orc army. 10 golems stepped over the wall and struck the crowd of orcs outside. Every blow from a clay fist sent an orc flying 10 paces. The golems didn't kill. They struck, they shoved, they crushed. The wall of clay flesh plowed through the orc ranks like a plow through the earth. The orcs spilled out. For the first time in the battle, they retreated. They didn't run. Orcs don't run. But they retreated. Goruk saw it from the wall. His army was retreating before the mud, before the clay, before chunks of earth that feel no pain and never tire. Devon stood on the tower behind his soldiers. Blood was running from his nose. His hands shook with tension. He was commanding 500 units at once, and his brain was on fire, but he held on. One stood beside him, small, crooked, the first. And Devon sensed through the bond that one was helping. Not with words, not with orders. One took on part of the load. 10 soldiers on the right flank of the wall came under one's control. Devon hadn't ordered it. One did it himself. The 10 soldiers moved slightly differently, slightly less precisely, slightly slower, but enough. Devon felt the strain on his brain ease by a few percent. And those few percent allowed him to hold out for another hour. Goruk withdrew the army by evening. 2,600 combat ready, 900 wounded and out of action, not a single one killed. Devon ordered the golems not to finish them off, not to pursue, not to kill, only to press them back. The orcs retreated behind the first line. They set up camp. They tended to their wounds. Goruk sat by the fire and stared silently into the flames. In his entire life, no one had ever forced him to retreat. Goruk stood before the walls of Muddle for 3 more days. Devon did not attack. He did not provoke. He waited. On the second day, Goruk sent a single warrior to the gates, unarmed. The orc stood before the wall and shouted that the chieftain wished to speak. Devon stepped out, alone, this time without fear. He already knew that Goruk would not strike the negotiator. Orcs despised cowardice, but respected the ritual of a duel of honor and the rules of negotiation. Goruk waited for him behind the first line of defense, amid shattered clay mines and the rubble of field walls. Traces of yesterday's battle lay everywhere, clay shards mixed with orc blood. Goruk looked down at Devon, over 2 meters tall against a frail human body. The chieftain had said Devon fought like a rat, hiding behind walls, throws clay dolls, doesn't engage in fair combat. Devon replied that fair combat is a luxury of the strong. He isn't strong. He's smart. And his dolls had just stopped 3,500 of the continent's finest warriors. Goruk bared his teeth, but not out of anger, out of something else. Devon saw it in his eyes. Recognition. In his lifetime, Goruk had defeated human knights and elven mages. None of them had stopped him like this, with a wall of clay and tactics he couldn't understand. Devon offered peace, the same terms he'd conveyed through Crag: clay workers for the horde, trade, non-aggression. Goruk was silent. Then he asked why Devon hadn't killed a single orc in battle. 900 wounded, not a single dead. Devon replied that the dead don't trade. They don't build. They don't work. A dead orc is a lost resource for both sides. Goruk looked at him for a long time. Then he said a word Devon hadn't expected. He said that Devon thinks like an old orc, not like a warrior. Like a chieftain, one who counts heads, not swords. Goruk accepted peace, not an alliance, not friendship, peace, a truce. The horde would not attack the Clay Kingdom. The Clay Kingdom would supply laborers and construction crews, trade in iron and meat. Devon sealed the agreement with a handshake. Goruk's palm was the size of Devon's head. When the chieftain squeezed his hand, Devon thought his bones would crack. But Goruk squeezed just enough to show his strength, not to break them. The orcs left. 3,500 warriors turned and marched north. Devon stood on the wall and watched them go. 2 flanks were secured. The humans were trading. The orcs were in a truce. The 3rd flank remained. The elves. A week after the orcs left, Devon received a second message from Silwen. Not a letter this time, a messenger. The elf appeared on the road to Muddle at dawn. Tall, slender, silver hair down to her waist, eyes the color of old gold. She moved in such a way that she left no footprints in the wet clay. Devon met her at the gate. The messenger introduced herself as Ethna. She said that Empress Silwen was inviting Devon to the Forest Empire for a conversation, to exchange knowledge, so that Devon could learn the truth about his class, the whole truth. Devon asked what truth. Ethna replied that it was the truth about the first Weaver, about why the class had been sealed, and about what awaited Devon if he continued down this path. Devon thought. A trap, almost certainly. But the information Silwen was offering was something he couldn't get any other way. The elves had guarded their knowledge for millennia. If anyone knew the truth about the Potter, it was them. Devon decided to go. But not alone. Lissa went with him, and Odin, and 50 soldiers from the 2nd cohort. Lissa protested. She said that entering the elven forest with an army was a declaration of war. Devon replied that the soldiers would remain at the border. Only the 3 of them would go inside. Him, Lissa, Odin. The journey to the elven border took 4 days. The forest began abruptly. The steppe gave way, and trees rose up like a wall. Not ordinary trees, huge ones, trunks as wide as a house. The canopies closed over them in a solid dome through which no light could penetrate. The air inside the forest was different, old, heavy, smelling of moss and something ancient. Devon left the soldiers at the edge of the forest and entered with Lissa and One. Ethna led them along a path Devon could never have found on his own. The path wound between roots and vanished every 100 paces, only to reappear a short distance away. A living path, ever-changing. After 2 days' journey, they emerged at the capital of the Forest Empire, a city in the treetops, platforms and bridges 50 meters above the ground, buildings growing into the trunks. Light filtered through the foliage turned everything into green gold. Empress Sowen received Devon in the throne room at the top of the largest tree. The hall was carved from living wood. The walls breathed, roots pierced the floor like veins. Sowen sat on a throne of intertwined branches. She looked to be 30. Devon knew from Lissa that she was 800. Silwen's eyes were older than any stone on the continent. She looked at Devon, and Devon felt that she could see right through him. Not a metaphor, literally. Her magic scanned him just as she had scanned the clay worker at the border. Only now she was scanning Devon himself. Silwen spoke. She said Devon wasn't from this world. Devon didn't deny it. Silwen said she knew why he was here, that Devon's rebirth into the body of a Claymaker wasn't a coincidence, that the first Shaper had called him. Devon asked why. Silwen explained. 1,000 years ago, the last clayworker raised an army from the earth and nearly destroyed 3 empires. Not out of malice, out of desperation. Neutral villages were perishing. The 3 powers were grinding them down between them. The clayworker tried to create a 4th force, just like Devon now. The 3 empires united and destroyed him, and then they sealed off the class. They built a limiter into the system, so that the next Claymaker could never connect directly to the continent's clay, so that he could only mold small, weak servants, useless, trash. Devon listened and felt a chill in his chest. He was following in his predecessor's footsteps, the same path, and his predecessor had failed. Silwen said she knew how to break the seal. Devon tensed. This was it. This was why he'd been summoned. Silwen wanted Devon to break the seal. Not for his sake, for herself. The Elven Empire was weakening. Few children, few warriors. Too long a life had made the elves cautious to the point of sterility. In 100 years, the horde would overwhelm them with numbers. In 200, the kingdom of men would swallow their lands. Silwen needed an ally, a 4th power. Devon, with his endless army of clay from the creator god. Devon asked what the price was. Silwen replied. An alliance. The Clay Kingdom and the Forest Empire against the Horde and the humans. Forever. Devon was silent for a long time. Then he replied that forever was too long a word for a mortal, and that his goal was not to destroy the 2 empires, but to bring all 4 sides to the table. Silwen smiled. For the first time during the entire conversation, she said that Devon was more interesting than his predecessor. He wanted war. Devon wants peace. But peace requires strength, and strength requires the seal to be broken. She handed Devon a small object, a stone, dark, smooth, cold, clay. Ancient clay fired in a fire that no longer exists. A shard of the first Shaper. Silwen said it was the key, that Devon must place it in the ground and call. Not command, call. Devon took the stone and felt his class tremble. How the system hummed, how the seal cracked. Devon returned to Muddle with the shard of the first Shaper on the 200th day. The stone lay in his pocket, pulsing with warmth. Devon felt it like a second heart. The system trembled at the edge of his consciousness, ready for something he had not yet done. Devon was in no hurry. He had spent 3 years building a kingdom worthy of this moment. 3 years had passed since his visit to Silwen. 3 years in which Devon had turned 4 villages into 5 cities. Muddle became the capital, Fen, a trading hub, Holt, a river port, Bray, a forest outpost. The 5th city, Clayhaven, grew at the intersection of 3 trade routes as a symbol of the new world. The population of the Clay Kingdom had reached 10,000 living people. Refugees were coming from all corners of the no man's lands. Word of a place where no tribute was demanded and no one was robbed, where clay workers built houses for free and walls protected against any army, had spread throughout Korhast. Devon welcomed everyone. Every person is a resource. Every artisan is a new branch of technology. Every soldier is knowledge that can be imprinted into clay. The clay people grew to 2,000 combat units, 1,000 second-tier soldiers, 200 elite archers with the imprinted skills of elven archers that Devon had received as part of an informal exchange with Silwyn, 30 siege golems, and 5,000 workers who built roads, bridges, walls, houses, workshops, and farms tirelessly and without pause. Tariq led an engineering corps of 50 blacksmiths and craftsmen. He developed the third tier of soldiers, composite warriors made of clay, stone, metal, and fabric. Each was as durable as 3 soldiers from the second tier. Each carried real iron weapons forged in the workshops of Fen. Lissa managed a reconnaissance network covering the entire continent. 40 agents in the cities of humans, orcs, and on the borders of the elven forest. Information flowed to her daily. She knew the army's movements before their own commanders did. Court trained a militia of 300 living volunteers, not for combat, for support, logistics, medicine, intelligence, communications. Living people did what the clay people could not: think, improvise, feel. Mela managed the kingdom's civilian life: courts, resource allocation, education, medicine. She had transformed from a frightened elder of a destitute village into an iron-willed chancellor who kept 10,000 people in order and well-fed. One had changed the most. He had grown. Not physically, mentally. Devon stopped giving him orders in the second year. There was no need. One understood Devon's intentions without words. He commanded the Muddle garrison on his own. He assigned patrols. He changed the guard rotations. He trained new soldiers. The small, crooked figure, no taller than Devon's knee, had become the general of the clay army. The other clay figures were changing too, more slowly than one, but they were changing. The old servants who had long worked under Devon's constant supervision began to show initiative. A worker sent to dig a ditch saw that the ditch was leading toward the wall and changed direction so as not to undermine the foundation. A soldier on guard noticed suspicious movement and moved closer without orders. The clay people were waking up, slowly, hesitantly, but unstoppably. Devon knew this was the work of the first maker's clay. The clay remembered what it meant to live, and every servant created by Devon carried that memory within them, just as a seed carries a tree within it. It only takes time and attention for it to sprout. In the third year, the Cold War between the three empires finally erupted. The Horde marched on the kingdom of men. The human king summoned his vassals. The elves closed their borders and watched. The continent was engulfed in flames. Devon had been waiting for this. In RTS, the moment two opponents lock horns is an opening for a third. But Devon did not attack. He offered to mediate. For the first time in Korhast's history, a neutral party proposed ending the war. The humans refused. The orcs laughed. The war raged on for 3 months. The Horde reached the walls of the human city of Valthern. The human army was retreating. Duke Vashton begged the king for help. And then Devon made his move. He led his army out. Not against the orcs, not against the humans. Between them. 2,000 clay warriors stood as a wall between the orc horde and the human city. Devon stood on a hill before his army. Odin to his right, Lissa to his left. Behind them, rows of clay soldiers stood motionless. 2,000 figures of fired clay with iron weapons and blank faces. In sync, silent, patient. Goruk saw Devon and halted the advance. He remembered the walls of Muddle. He remembered how his army had retreated from the clay defenses. The human general saw the clay army and didn't know what to think. Savior or new enemy? Devon didn't wait for them to decide. He sent messengers to both sides with the same message. A truce, negotiations, now. Devon placed a shard of the first weaver into the ground between the two armies. He didn't command, he called. The clay of the continent answered. The earth trembled, not violently, not destructively, just a tremor, like the sigh of a creature that had slept for 1,000 years and finally awoken. Walls rose from the ground, not small ones, huge ones. A wall of living clay grew between the orc and human armies, 10 meters high, a kilometer long, in seconds. Goruk recoiled. The human general turned pale. Devon stood on the hill and felt all the clay of the continent. Every stratum, every layer, from coast to coast. The seal was broken. The Claymaker class had revealed itself fully. Devon could raise an army from the earth at any point in Korhast. He could raise walls. He could create a city in a day. He could mold 1,000 soldiers with a single effort of will. He could destroy all 3 empires. He could subjugate the continent. He could become a god of clay. Devon did none of these things. He lowered the wall back into the ground, slowly, carefully, showing what he could raise and what he could take away. A demonstration, not a threat, an offer. Devon told both armies that negotiations would take place in Clayhaven in a month, and that this time there would be 4 people sitting at the table. The negotiations lasted 3 weeks. The human king arrived with distrust and fear. Goruk arrived with respect and caution. Silwen came with a smile that hid 1,000 years of calculation. Devon sat at the head of the table, a frail young man in simple clothes. Standing next to him was Odin, small, crooked, the first clay servant, the first citizen of the Clay Kingdom, the first representative of the new people of Korhast. Devon proposed peace, not temporary, permanent. 4 powers, 4 territories, trade instead of war, law instead of force, and one condition that was non-negotiable. No one would ever raid neutral villages again. Ever. Devon spoke calmly. No threats, no ultimatums. But everyone in the hall knew that behind him stood a power capable of raising an army from beneath the feet of any enemy, anywhere on the continent. They knew and remembered the wall that had risen between the 2 armies in a matter of seconds. The human king signed. Goruk pressed the imprint of his fang onto the parchment. Silwen affixed a magical seal. Devon sealed the treaty with a seal of fired clay. 4 signatures. 4 powers, for the first time in 1,000 years. That evening, after the signing, Devon stood on the roof of the council hall in Clayhaven, the city he had built from mud. Lights burned below, living people and the clay folk walked the streets side by side. Workers carried bricks, soldiers stood on the walls, children ran between the legs of the golems, who stepped carefully so as not to step on them. Lissa stood beside him. She said that Devon had done the impossible. He had turned a destitute village into a power. He had forced 3 empires to sit down at the table. He had created a new people out of clay. Devon replied that he hadn't created the people. The clay had always been alive. He had simply given it form. One stood on the other side, small, crooked, the first. Devon looked at him. One raised a clay hand and placed it on the edge of the wall next to Devon's hand, without touching, beside it, as an equal. Devon smiled. 5 years ago, he died on stage at the World Finals of real-time strategy. A world champion who never got to receive his trophy. Now he stood on the roof of a city that hadn't been on the map 5 years ago. All around lay a continent of clay, the creation of the creator god. Behind him stood the people he had molded with his own hands. And these people were beginning to live. For real. Devon looked at the stars of Korhast, the stars of a foreign world. But the city beneath his feet was his. The people who believed in him were his. And the small, crooked figure beside him, who had learned to desire, to rejoice, and to protect, was his first friend in this world. Devon rubbed his hands. Clay remained on his fingers. It always remained. Devon no longer tried to wash it off. He closed his eyes and felt the continent. The clay beneath his feet. The clay beneath the mountains and rivers and forests. The clay from which all the races of Korhast were made. The clay from which he had molded his own story. The game is over. The champion has won.